Thanks, Hamilton, and it's great to be back in Adelaide and great to be in this fantastic venue for this launch today. As followers of policy and the economy, no doubt you're well aware of these dominant narratives that we've had around economic growth driving prosperity, long-term economic reform agendas being necessary to boost future living standards. And despite the dominance of these narratives and this long, unbroken record of growth that we've had, there seems to be a bit of scepticism in the community around the benefits of economic growth. And for the Committee for Economic Development, I stress economic development of Australia, this is really important. And it goes to the heart of what meaningful economic development is and how we get people engaged in long-term economic reform agendas. And so to further understand this issue and get to the bottom of it, we thought it would be good to ask the community what they thought about economic development. And so, if I get my slides, we went out and polled almost 3,000 people, a representative sample of the Australian population. And we asked them questions in three areas. Firstly, did they feel like they had gained from 26 years of continuous economic growth? Also, what were the most important issues, both for them personally, but also as they saw it for the future success of the country? We also asked how they were faring in their jobs. And this gave us national results. It also gave us state breakdowns as well. And as I go through the results today, I'll point out where the state results for South Australia are different. In many cases, the state results were quite consistent, but I'll point out the differences here. So just to put this 26 years of economic growth that we've had into a little bit of context, it began in the September quarter of 1991 after the recession that we had to have. And if I think about the policy environment we had at that time, we didn't quite have a superannuation guarantee. States didn't squabble over the goods and services tax because we didn't have one. We had a top marginal tax rate that kicked in at $50,000, and Telstra was still a government enterprise. Since that time, the Australian economy's doubled in real terms, and average disposable incomes have gone up by about 70%. Here in South Australia, the economy is about 3/4 bigger than it was back then. And so despite these impressive numbers, when we asked people whether they'd gained, just 5% said that they'd gained a lot nationally, and that result held in South Australia as well. 40% said they'd gained a little. I think it was 42% in South Australia, so a little bit of difference there. And 55% of people nationally saying that they had not gained or they didn't know if they'd gained. And finally, people over the age of 50, 50% of those people said that they had not gained at all. So these are people who've spent the prime of their working life in the workforce during this key period of economic growth. So for us, that was a bit of a moment of pause. We may not have thought that everything would be rosy, but we were a little bit surprised by the magnitude of the results there. And I guess it's a reminder of going below the headline numbers sometimes in terms of the economy, and the fact that people are really living in the here and now, and their current circumstances really reflect their mood. And certainly that 26 years of economic growth, it hasn't all been even. So even if I look at disposable incomes over that time, increased 2% on average a year over the 26 years. But then if I look at the last decade, it's down to 1%. If I look at the last 5 years, it's obviously flatlined. So current circumstances, I think, matter a lot. So if we look at who people thought had gained a lot, 3/4 thought that large companies had gained. And in South Australia, that was about 72%, so not a whole lot of difference there. When we look at shareholders, so this I found an interesting result. 31% of people thought that Australian shareholders had gained a lot, but that clearly didn't seem to translate into the personal gains, despite the fact that we obviously most of us hold Australian shares in our superannuation. So clearly I take from this that the message around economic growth equaling prosperity is not cutting through, and that a lot of people in the community don't feel connected to economic growth at the present time. So the next part of the survey, we looked at what was most important to people, and we looked at 30 issues, both personal and national, and 30 might sound like a lot. I can tell you it was hard to get from the 90 that some of my colleagues wanted to do down to the 30, so it was quite a few, but we got there in the end. It represents different dimensions of economic development, so you know, employment, education, sustainability, and those broader kind of factors. And we asked people to rank their most important and least important issue from a set of issues that kept rolling up on their screen effectively. And the benefit of this approach was that, unlike a lot of other surveys, you can't just say everything's important, you have to make trade-offs. And in terms of the outputs that you get from that, one of them is just a percentage of people who responded least important and most important. And as well as giving you the things that are obviously most important, gives you these sets of issues sitting in the middle, which are some of the most contested. So where you have a large number of people saying something's least important, but an equally large number saying that it's most important to them. So it can indicate some division and kind of contested issues there. So if we start to look at the issues that people ranked as most important. So on the personal front, a very strong focus on those kind of fundamental services, and health was right up there. So we look at average importance scores. An average importance issue was a score of 3. Health was 9, so 3 times more important than average for people. Low cost essential services not far behind at an 8. And then you had obviously housing, chronic disease services, and reduced violence in homes and communities. So these top issues nationally held at the South Australian level, but these top issues pretty much held everywhere. So then if we look at some of the additional issues that crept up into that widely important category for South Australia, mental health services and employment opportunities for young adults. And I won't kind of try and go into some of the reasoning behind some of these things at this point, but we can certainly pick up that in the Q&A. So surprisingly unimportant, and right across the East Coast, reduced commuting times were not something that people mentioned, despite all the press that these things get, particularly in Sydney and Melbourne, but Brisbane as well. Access to high quality communications technologies, that was quite a surprise to us. Also ability to move between jobs and sectors with ease. Job security came through as the big employment imperative for people, was always top of mind through most of the parts of the survey. So then if I look at some of those issues that are most contested, where you've got an equal number putting it as least and most important, private health insurance, probably not surprising given some of the kind of angst around premiums and out-of-pocket costs that's there. Interestingly, in South Australia, a robust social safety net was one of the contested issues. Also, South Australia actually had very few of these contested personal issues, much less than other states, and the least. So there's something unified in terms of your population's personal priorities, it seems, which seems like a good thing to me in terms of driving consensus on some of these issues. So then if we look at the issues that are most important on a national perspective, and again, health comes through in the top in terms of public hospitals. Also limits on foreign ownership, which I was frankly a little bit surprised by, given that there has been a lot of tightening up of that regulation, and also not too many major transactions in the press at the moment. Also looking after the aged, so aged care and pension payments was another one there, and criminal laws and sentencing. And you'll see on the bottom there, South Australia energy security was another one that came into that top list on top of the national ones. So if we look at the issues that were unimportant, strong private school system, lower company taxes, increased humanitarian intake of refugees, less business regulation, and also a strong private hospital system. So you can see that preference for government service provision that seems to be coming through in that. These nationally unimportant issues were also held in South Australia as well. And if we look at the contested issues, nationally it was immigration, lower immigration, and also limitations on foreign worker visas, and that's obviously an issue that's playing out at present, particularly in federal parliament. In South Australia it was foreign worker visas, and interestingly enough lower personal taxes was contested as well. So I guess the message that I take out of this, clearly access to these high quality health and social services and supports are really important to people. There seems to be a preference in there for government service provision. So clearly the desire for social compact is very strong, and we kind of need to make sure that we're connecting things back to some of those aspirations that people have, both personal and national. But of course there's some challenges here in terms of some of the tensions and trade-offs that it presents. There was clearly not much support for some of the things that we've traditionally come to expect in terms of economic reforms that drive more competitive business sector. So those things didn't have great resonance. We also know in terms of service provision in the future that there's going to have to be significant productivity and innovation in areas like health, but we know that that's also generally seen as a bit of a negative. So some reasonable challenges there. We also looked at jobs, as I said, really wanted to, at the national level, we're obviously seeing unemployment come down, as you saw on Michael's chart today, and we're seeing some strong employment growth. Underneath that, underutilisation, so if you look at people who are looking for more hours as well as people who are unemployed, that's been hovering at around 14% for a little while now nationally. Here in South Australia it's about 15%, and obviously there's the continuing wages story. There's also obviously uncertainty around the impact of emerging technologies. So we thought at this time it's really interesting to see what is on people's minds in terms of work. And so what did we find? In terms of job satisfaction, this was actually a positive for South Australia, and I don't know, people in the room can probably smile or frown depending on whether they agree with this. So 57% of South Australians, that was kind of the average across the different aspects, and it was closer to 50% nationally. People were also particularly happy with their job training and development relative to the national population here. I guess the other theme that came through was the strong link between the security of one's job and how satisfied they were with it. So right from averages of 60% for permanent full-time, all the way down to 18% for temporary casual people. So then if we look at work-life balance, this was actually a pretty positive one, and again a pretty positive one for South Australia relative to the rest of the population. We saw greater than 60% satisfaction levels across most aspects of work-life balance that you can see there. The only one where they dipped below that was the ability to work from home. That was an area where people seem to be less satisfied. Also, South Australians very happy with their travel time to and from work, which I suspect is a really big part of some of the work satisfaction as well in terms of use of time. And certainly I envy that less than 30 minutes. That would be fantastic to get into that kind of place. So we also asked about technology, and interestingly, right across the population, people were pretty optimistic about technology in the workplace. So greater than 70% of people saying that they'd welcome technology in the workplace, and a very small proportion of people saying that they were worried that it would replace them. Now, I think there's an open question in terms of how you interpret that. In other parts of the survey, we saw less importance placed on things like continuing education throughout one's working life. So I guess just an open question there on whether it is genuine optimism or whether there's also a little bit of complacency in there as well. So we also looked at future jobs and what people thought the priorities were for future job creation, and very clearly it was on more jobs to bring down unemployment, followed by more secure jobs to reduce work insecurity. Some of the things around creating more innovative jobs were kind of much lower down the order of priorities for people. Also, you can see we asked people about what they thought was important in terms of their future job, and you can see there that South Australians place greater emphasis on career progression, also other benefits such as superannuation. So obviously you've got the report in front of you, so dive into it. Also have a look at the website. We've got some data interactives that you can go through as well in terms of comparing your response to where the national averages are. I guess the other thing just to flag in terms of next steps is that our next report, which we'll release in November, is really going to try and seek to come up with some answers to some of the questions that we've kind of purposefully raised and provoked through this survey. And that's really about, how do we ensure that we do maintain future growth, but that it's accompanied by really meaningful economic development, and what are some of the policy levers and priorities that CEDA should be pursuing in the years ahead in order to meet that. So I'll leave it there, but thanks for your attention.